Welcome to Tough Talk Media, where real conversations shape real impact. Join us as we dig deeper into thought-provoking perspectives that challenge, inform, and inspire action. Subscribe today and be part of the conversation.
Welcome back to the program, everyone. Let's continue talking the Anambra Governorship Elections. This time, we cross over live to Abuja studios, where Mr. Samson Itodo is standing by, Executive Director, YIAGA Africa. Thank you, indeed, as always, Mr. Itodo, for joining us on the program. In this part of the world, sometimes we say,
always a delight.
Let's get to talk the elections in Anambra State, because I had to read your statement, which you put out after the elections. You were on this platform before and during the elections and even after. So, coming into these elections, the credibility and integrity of INEC was seriously questioned, and that of the new man, the new sheriff in town, Professor Joash Amukwito. So I wonder, perhaps with this performance from INEC, as you have captured, I wonder perhaps if you think the choice of Professor Amukwito has been justified.
Well, that's a very difficult question because this is just the first election that he's managing. And the bigger question is, did this election meet certain tests? And we can talk about the test, because prior to the election, you note that Professor Amukwito came or assumed office less than 2 weeks before the election. And the election planning, had been concluded even before he came. And I'm sure when he assumed office, perhaps there were minimal changes that he made. But I think his presence, and as the chair of the commission, I think his presence to a large extent would have impacted and influenced the way the election was conducted, because as the chair of the commission, there are certain statutory responsibilities that you have. But the Electoral Commission isn't about an individual. It's a collective of people. The chair, the national commissioners, the resident electoral commissioners, the electoral officers. It's a constellation. The personal integrity of all these individuals is critical for the credibility of an election. Having said that, if we would assess INEC's performance in this election, the first point is to look at the whole test of efficiency. And what we mean here is that, did INEC manage the logistics for the Anambra elections in a way that indicated that the commission is conscious of the fact that poor logistics can impact on public confidence in the electoral process? When you look at Anambra, 3 elections prior to now, Anambra is notorious for recording late commencement of elections since 2013. In fact, in 2021, by 7:30, only 17% of polling units had opened. When you compare that election and even the last 2 or 3 elections with this election, there was a marked improvement in the deployment of election logistics and materials. Because based on our observation, that by 7:30 a.m. on Saturday, polling officials and materials had arrived in 49% of polling units. Even though the commission didn't record over 50%, but it's a marked improvement. But there are several issues that need to be addressed with respect to logistics. By 10:30 a.m., in 98% of polling units, accreditation and voting had commenced, which is really a deviation from 2021. So to that extent, you can say that there was an improvement in the management of logistics, but it doesn't mean that there weren't logistic challenges. There were still logistic challenges, but compared to previous elections, this was a marked improvement. The second point was, when you look at the results management process and look at IREV performed optimally and results were uploaded promptly on Saturday. By 8 p.m. on Saturday, 98% of all the results from the polling units were already uploaded on the INEC's IREV portal. And the whole process of collating the results was very seamless. And we at YIAGA Africa, with our partners in the Election Observation Hub, did deploy observers to the collation centers. And because we deployed the parallel vote tabulation, we are in a better position to speak to the accuracy of the results that was declared by INEC. And yesterday we issued a statement verifying the results, that they fall within our estimates, and to that extent that the official results declared by INEC are indeed the results declared by the polling units. If those results were altered either at the ward or at the local government collation, we would have been able to detect it. And to that extent, we have some measure of confidence, in the results declared. However, there are fundamental issues that we need to interrogate. The first one relates to the level of vote buying in the elections. And you clearly see that this election, to a large extent, was determined by the highest bidder and the highest spender. That the two major political formations in the state were involved in procuring votes between 1,000 and 15,000 based on the reports from our observers. And like I mentioned, that the Election Observation Hub, we deployed over 711 observers. And so that election was obscenely commercialized, and that really raises questions as to, one, the security agencies who were deployed for the election. How many arrests were made? How come that there was widespread vote buying and we only hear of 3 arrests, as reported by channels that the EFCC effected, when there are reported cases, of vote buying? The second relates to the issue about turnout. This turnout was quite dismal. But again, it's not just about Anambra. Of course, across the country, you record low turnout. But whilst compared to 2021, there's a 10% increase in the level of turnout. This turnout raises a question, and it's time for us to have a national conversation about this crisis of low turnout, particularly amongst young people who didn't show up in their large numbers in this election.
So I'd like you to speak a bit more about the vote buying component in this election, and I'm going to put it in proper context. Some of the reports that we got, we heard the complainants about vote buying blaming INEC, for allowing it to go on. So from your own observations and from the reports that you got from your other observers on the field, was INEC's inability to rein in on vote buying due to being overwhelmed, or was it a challenge of just looking away and allowing it, to thrive?
So let's look at the patterns of vote buying in the Anambra elections. And there are 3 patterns that we identified in the course of our observation. The first one was that political party agents came to polling units with notebooks, and they were taking records of voters who were casting votes for their political party. Because based on our PVT data, in 18% of polling units, the voting cubicle was placed in a way that voters could expose, their vote. So you can clearly tell how a particular voter, voted. In fact, one of the major candidates violated, Section 122 of the Electoral Act regarding secrecy of the ballot. Because after voting, he clearly displayed, his ballot paper to indicate where he had voted. That is an aberration, of the rule of law. And it's impunity. And because few years ago, the former President Buhari voted and did the same thing, where he displayed his ballot to show where he actually voted. This act of impunity is what is reinforced by the actions we see from voters. So we cannot blame voters when leaders who should show example are not showing example because they feel that they can break the law and no one will sanction them. So that's the first pattern. The second pattern was that we also saw cases where POS machines were being used to effect vote trading in some of the polling units. And the last one was the traditional, deploying of resources and cash, to polling units, and you could see that exchange happening. And some of those polling units were really turned to auction centers because they've just become marketplaces as opposed to sites where voters are exercising their sovereignty in a constitutional democracy like ours. And so in fact, some of security officials deployed to 98% of polling units. How come that the security agents have not come public to tell Nigerians the number of people they arrested, except the EFCC? Because in those polling units, you also have what? You have security agents. INEC officials are not saddled with the responsibility of arrest. That's why you have the security agencies. And so we should also ask the security agencies the same question, because sometimes some of these acts are perpetrated within the bounds of the polling units that are not visible to the INEC officials. It doesn't mean that in some cases the presiding officers cannot see them. I was in a polling unit where the presiding officer was reprimanding some of the voters, cautioning them on displaying their ballot papers. But it takes, security agencies and other actors performing their responsibility to prevent these acts of deviant political behavior that undermines the legitimacy of outcome. Because some can contest that perhaps the outcome and even the turnout and also the outcome is what you call procured turnout or procured outcome. Because it might not be a reflection of the will and aspiration of the people, because the choice was compromised ab initio. And we leave room for people to raise these questions when agencies that have the responsibility of regulating and protecting the secrecy of the ballot do not perform their responsibility.
So when you say the two main political formations were complicit in vote buying, are you talking about the ruling party and in the state and the opposition party? Which of the opposition parties, by the way?
Let me state unequivocally, based on reports received from our observers in the Election Observation Hub, both the ABGA party and the APC party were involved in buying votes, and their agents who had their tags, at the polling units, we saw them because they had the tags of these parties. They were involved in buying these votes, and that's just unfortunate, for our democracy. And these acts need to stop because they make a mockery of elections. When polling stations and polling units become marketplaces where votes are being traded, it doesn't augur well for the health of our democracy. And I hope that political actors would rethink their approach towards electoral competition, because this does not augur well for our democracy.
Just before we leave the vote buying matter, before the elections, there were debates as to the comment made by the governor in which he was incentivizing their party, if you like, foot soldiers to go get the people to come out and vote with a promise of a reward that will be given after the election. I believe 5 million naira was quoted at the time. And there's a debate over the propriety about that particular comment. I want you to speak to what the Constitution says about vote buying and if that constitutes to a remote form of vote buying.
The fact that we are debating this issue, it's just problematic for me. Now, I understand that perhaps there is a dividing line between programs instituted by incumbents to deliver service to the people. And yes, state governments have a responsibility to deliver service. They have a responsibility to deliver empowerment programs because that's what they've promised the people. When those programs, those developmental programs are now structured and situated in a way that it influences the voting choices that people make, especially when it's few days to elections or during the electioneering period, those could be misinterpreted as voter inducement, especially when the buyer or the state actor is quoted, to clearly say that if you vote for me, this is what you would receive, or I am providing this for you to vote for me. So that is problematic in its respect. And it also speaks to, the undue advantage that incumbent has. And sometimes it's that contestation, and I've mentioned is that there's really a dilemma often. But you can clearly see that incumbents exploit this gap to their advantage. And sometimes they delay some programs when it is close to the elections because they want to incur or curry the support of voters for elections. And the law is very clear about bribery and conspiracy. This is why, drawing from the experience in Anambra, and now that we are amending our electoral law, we hope that the National Assembly will take a closer look at the Electoral Act and introduce stiffer provisions and sanctions for any attempt by any political actor or any individual, to induce voters, whether using financial or using programmatic or using any particular tool whatsoever, provided it is targeted at influencing the voters. Because what we do is we weaponize poverty, we compromise the independent and voluntary choice that voters ought to make when they are voting at elections. Because when they are surrendering their rights to a certain individual or to political party, they have to do that voluntarily and based on freedom. When it is not free, it's no longer democracy. It's something else. And that's something that we need to drive home so our political actors understand that when you buy votes, at the end of the day, it questions the legitimacy of that election. You can no longer say it's a product of the free choice of people who have subscribed either to your party manifesto or your programs and plans for them.
Mr. Itodo, so if we are to do some sort of comparisons with elections around the world, walk us through your experience. I mean, I know that you travel a lot, you cover elections in other parts of the continent. So walk us through, let's just do some sort of comparisons as to what you see in some of those countries and what we have here. This issue of vote buying, for instance, is it a Nigerian problem, or do we have it playing out as well in some other parts of the continent?
Vote buying is not a Nigerian problem. It's cut across the world. Because in the field of elections, candidates and political parties go to voters and say, voters, we need you to vote for us. Because if you vote for us, we can give you a better life. We can improve your socioeconomic conditions. And on the basis of that, they enter a contract between the people and themselves when they get elected. And that's the whole concept, of the social contract theory, that we have vested certain roles and responsibilities on a particular individual, a particular institution, or a political party to now take decisions on our behalf. And in return, the party will provide security, would also provide for our welfare. So there is actually a space for marketing and promoting programs. Now, the challenge, across board is that when, you induce voters, and the reason why you want them to vote for you is because you have procured and you've bought over their voice, the choices they make, it's no longer legitimate. And I'll say to a large extent, it's not out of their free will. It happens in places like Ghana. In the last Ghana election, we saw how a politician, donated and gave television sets and food items. In fact, it also happened in the US. In the last election, there were also instances of voter inducement. The bigger question for us is, how do we regulate this within our own jurisdiction? And this is why I have said repeatedly that it is important that, one, when you arrest people in the polling units with cash, trying to undermine the choices that people make, they have to face the full wrath of the law. Our anti-corruption agencies also need to continuously, and they've done remarkably well, but they need to up their game, especially around intelligence. Because 24 hours before the Anambra elections, we saw how in some of the hotels, there was a lot of cash moving around. In fact, cash, whether it's a Ghana must go bags, they were all getting ready to deploy those resources. How come that missed the intelligence of some of our security agencies? And when you ask the whole point about money laundering, how come you can have one individual in possession of millions of naira? That's against the Money Laundering Act. How come there were not prevailing on those people, sanctioning them? These are some of the things that we can do within our own climb. So far, the EFCC has said they only effected 3 arrests. There were more than 3 instances of vote buying in the Anambra elections. And you note that it's not just the Anambra elections. In all the elections we've had in the last 10 years, they've been signposted by all forms of vote buying. And this is where, again, we have to declare this a state of national emergency if we really care about political legitimacy as a country.
So, who gets the biggest share of the blame? The electoral umpire, INEC, politicians, or the people? Who gets the biggest share of the blame?
The big question is who is the buyer? And we've seen cases where, and I think this is really shared, to be honest. The political class have a role. And why are they buying votes? They are buying votes because to a large extent votes are beginning to count. If those votes do not matter, I tell you, politicians will not buy the votes. They know that votes are counted because of some of the reforms introduced in the electoral process. That's why they try to mobilize voters, induce them to go to the polling units to vote for them. So I think the political class, this weaponization of poverty needs to be regulated. It needs to stop within our electoral jurisprudence. The second, are the voters themselves. There has to be a willing buyer and a willing seller. And so, yes, there may be poverty in the land, but voters also need to understand that when you sell your vote, you lose your voice. There is no way someone who has bought over your voice will be accountable to you for the next 4 years. And that's why it is dangerous. And the bigger question to ask yourself, what will 15,000 naira do for you within 4 years? Because when you sell your vote for 15,000, just one day, that act that you commit one day will cost you for the rest of the 4 years of bad governance, because the leader will not be accountable to you. You can no longer ask any question. So there is the cost to the voter when you sell your votes, at elections. And I think also our anti-corruption agencies and our security agencies, they have a responsibility of arrest and prosecution of electoral offenders. Vote buying is an electoral offense. It is crafted in our electoral law as bribery and conspiracy in today's 2022 Electoral Act. And so, if it's an electoral offense, who has a responsibility of arrest, investigation? Perhaps, yes, INEC has the responsibility of prosecution. We need to see more prosecution. We need to see more people go to jail for vote buying. Maybe it might serve as a deterrence. So it's not just the politicians. The voters also have a share of the blame, but also the other institutions like security agencies, because elections is a multi-stakeholder enterprise, and we cannot vest the blame on one institution alone. It's going to take the constellation of every effort by every stakeholder to nip this menace in the bud.
All right. Mr. Itodo, I'd like you to speak to another issue which may just be related to vote buying. That's the level of voter apathy that characterized the election. Indeed, we're reporting 10% increase from what was, recorded in the last election in Anambra State. But compared with the number of registered voters in this election, it is still dismal. What are you fingering as responsible for the level of voter apathy in this election?
I think there are a myriad of reasons why you have voter apathy. And yes, Anambra may have, prior to now, may have the lowest or may have had the lowest turnout for governorship elections. But the voter apathy It's a national scourge, it's a national menace, and we must situate this within the national question. In 2023, you had only 25%, of voters show up to vote at the presidential elections. Now you've had only 21.3% in Anambra elections, because in 2021, it was just 10.27%. We need to agree and recognize that it is unacceptable, it is an anomaly for the minority of us to be determining who governs the majority of us. It's just totally unacceptable. In a democracy, it is majority that should have the say and have their way, and not the other way around. But what we have done in Anambra is that the minority that showed up, or the minority who were induced to show up, are now the ones determining for the rest. And we must note this, that there is a cost of not showing up to elections, to our economy, to our democracy, and also to the quality of governance. INEC budgeted for the over 2 million registered voters in Anambra. Each of those voters was assigned a particular ballot paper. If only 21% showed up, it means that over 2 million over 2 million ballot papers have gone to waste. That is monies that would have been used to procure and impact other sectors of the state. The second point is, when voters don't show up, it's either a referendum on the Electoral Commission or on our security agencies because of the lack of trust. But I say in the Anambra elections, INEC did everything, provided what it needed to do, to encourage voters to show up. The security agencies also deployed massively. And so when you look at the peaceful conduct of the election, you really ask yourself, how come that despite this peaceful conduct, people didn't show up? And I think it just boils down to how voters perceived the impact of their participation to the quality of their life. And I've said this consistently, that if voters don't see an improvement in their social condition, if the voters don't see that they are part of a nation state that cares about their well-being and protects them, they would not be motivated or incentivized, to go cast their votes. Because think about it, with even the level of vote buying in Anambra, you still record this turnout. It tells you that the voters, by staying away, they are sending a strong message to the political class that you cannot organize an election 4 years when 4 years before you have not given a fair account of the mandate that they've placed on you. And let me reiterate that this is not just in Anambra, it's about a national question, and that as a country, we need to have a national conversation. That low turnout of votes is indeed a national crisis, and it says a lot about the health of Nigeria's democracy.
Stay informed, stay inspired, stay tuned to Tough Talk Media, where real conversations shape real impact. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking discussion. Thanks for watching.